The Essequibo region of Guyana has suddenly become the focus of international attention. It is a region about two-thirds the size of the country. Now the president of neighbouring Venezuela, President Maduro, is making renewed claims over it. Venezuela's official maps have been changed. Oil firms have been ordered to start extracting there, and it follows a questionable referendum at the start of the month with allegations that it was rigged in the government's favour. The leaders of both nations are due to meet this Thursday. So for today's Perspective, we're looking deeper at what's going on, why now, and what next? Let's bring in Christopher Sabatini. He's a Senior Research Fellow for the Latin America, US and Americas Programme at Chatham House Institute. Good to see you, Christopher. This is a centuries-old dispute. Since when Guyana was a British colony, the land, if I'm right in saying, was granted to Guyana by international arbitration back in the late 1800s, I think 1899. So what's the Venezuelan case for it?
Well, the Venezuelan case is based on, first, that area was originally under Spanish colonial rule. The British then took it actually from the Dutch, and it became part of British Guyana. And then when the map was redrawn, it was included in Guyana. So because of the fact that it was originally Spanish and what would have been part of Venezuela at the time of independence, Venezuelan claim it's their own. But of course, it was conquered. And then, as you mentioned, in 1899, in arbitration in Paris, it was determined that the borders were there and would give the Essequibo region to Guyana. Since then, the Venezuelan governments subsequently have argued in 1966 that the Paris arbitration agreement was null and void and that there should be a new negotiation. But that's been pending for the International Court of Justice.
Right, that brings us on to the why now question, Christopher. Fast forward to 2020, the world's newest oil exporting nation, Guyana. The scale of change is immense in terms of money coming into the country. Coincidence?
Not at all. First of all, in 2015, as you mentioned, they discovered oil off the coast of the Essequibo region. They discovered 11 billion barrels of recoverable oil. This occurs at the time that in Venezuela, oil production has slumped dramatically. It went from 2,000 actually closer to 3,000 barrels a day in 2000, down to about 700,000 barrels a day, largely because of corruption and lack of investment in infrastructure in Venezuela. So now they're looking at a region that they always thought was their own and huge riches just across the border. There is something else that's driving this as well, and that's President Nicolás Maduro's lack of popularity and international pressure to hold credible, free and fair elections in 2024 for the presidency. And right now, there's an opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, that the government has disqualified from running. But in head-to-head polls, she would easily beat Nicolás Maduro. So this is an easy way for Nicolás Maduro to wrap himself in the Venezuelan flag, try to distract the Venezuelan population and voters from its own really quite dramatic humanitarian crisis, as well as possibly prevent there being election in 2024.
Let me quote some interesting figures to you of Guyana. So this is the per capita GDP 2019 before the sales of oil exports, about $6,500. Fast forward to what they're going to see in 2025, expected to be $45,000. That's above Japan per capita GDP. And so from the poorest, one of the poorest in South America, suddenly this fast-growing economy. Are people in Guyana themselves seeing any part of this oil rush?
It's taking some time to trickle down. The truth is, with the natural resource extraction economies, whether it's oil or iron ore or copper, they don't generate a lot of jobs, first of all. There's very little sort of forward or backward linkage on these products that can be created. Similarly, the technology and the drilling and the companies that do it, in this case in Essequibo, it's ExxonMobil, tend to be the primary drivers of this extraction and production. But having said that, as you mentioned, the distribution of rents from the oil is going to be huge. Guyana last year grew by 80%. Its economy grew by 80%. That means there's lots of patronage and rents to be distributed across the population. But in terms of a sustainable economy, a diverse economy, it's going to be difficult. But for an economy or a country of only 800,000 people, that level of growth, that level of revenue is going to make a tremendous difference on their infrastructure. But it also makes a huge temptation for massive corruption.
Which leads me on nicely, ExxonMobil, for my question about what is in it for the US to become involved, given that they've now started joint patrols with Guyana, much to the disgruntlement of Venezuela, calling it a provocation. Tell me about what potentially the US interest is here.
It's significant. I mean, first, ExxonMobil is obviously a U.S. company. It's obviously got a lot of lobbyists in Washington. It is really the primary driver of the oil exploration production in Guyana. And in fact, after the referendum last week, ExxonMobil's stock value didn't collapse, but it declined in New York. So, obviously, ExxonMobil is looking at what it thought was a safe bet in terms of its investment is now looking a little bit shaky. So yes, the U.S. is pro their production, and also pro more generally massive increases in oil production to stabilize global oil prices.
We
By the
have.
same
Sorry, carry
yeah,
on, Christopher. That's a very good point.
by the same token, obviously the U.S. wants to preserve international borders. I mean, this is really an illegal attempted land grab by Venezuela. So oil aside, there's very good reason to protect Guyana.
Right, let's look at Thursday. So you have the two presidents of both countries meeting. Does that indicate what, a possible calming of tensions, perhaps, or not?
It's difficult to say. The truth is, as you mentioned in the introduction, since the referendum, President Maduro has engaged in a series of real kind of blustery, even sort of aggressive rhetoric and acts. He created a Department of Essequibo, placed a general in charge of it. Of course, it's still under Guyanese control, and then is allowing and pushing for contracts to be made for oil exploration in Guyana. So it's difficult to see how he'll climb down. To be quite frank, too, the nature of this discussion is a little unclear, but a country stages a really a joke referendum, then engages in all the saber rattling, and there's going to be a conversation between the two countries to calm tensions. The truth is, the tensions only come from one side, and that is Venezuela. So I think it's a welcome move. I do think war between those two countries would be horrible in many levels, in part just for regional solidarity. But the nature of what's going to be discussed, the nature of what could be conceded to Venezuela is really unclear.
Very briefly, we have about 20 seconds left on the programme, Christopher, but you mentioned the risk of conflict. Do you think that it is increasingly likely, or are we moving past the point and it could calm a little?
I think it's improbable, but I think it's increasingly likely. I think most people wrote off this referendum last week as being somewhat of a joke. Now with the rhetoric, now with the ramping up of expectations, Brazil has even mobilized troops along the Brazilian-Guyanese border. So I think it's looking possible, not probable.
Christopher, excellent to talk to you. Really good to hear that context. Christopher Sabatini, Senior Research Fellow for Latin America, US and Americas Programme at the Chatham House Institute.